everybody. Welcome back to our weekly podcast. My name is Patrick Tan, General Counsel for ChainArgos. With me, as usual, every week, Jonathan Reiter, our Chief Data Scientist and CEO. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for tuning in. This week, we have it on time, on schedule. Back to you guys once again, the podcast. If you guys haven't watched it yet, I highly recommend that you not miss it. If for those of you who weren't able to join us in Bucharest in April, John's case study linking Russian scams, terrorists, and some I assume were good people, on his case study, and he was presenting that in the Palace of the Parliament in Bucharest. So that video is on the playlist as well. Please go.
Palace of the People.
Palace of the Parliament. Palace of the Parliament.
Oh, is it Parliament? Okay.
Yeah, Palace of the Parliament.
It was originally People. Maybe that's.
Yeah. The people gave it back to the Parliament. It's Palace of the Parliament. I checked. This one I'm quite specific on. Yeah. So have a watch of that video, which was held at the Palace of the Parliament, which is an incredible building, by the way. Having actually visited that building and been inside, that is pretty awesome. Well, you get glimpses of it. We were in one of the main halls. But yeah, have a watch of that case study. I enjoyed watching it as well. I hope you had a good time presenting it. But definitely, it was as some said, was the highlight of the program. So be sure to catch that on the channel. So, but this week, what we're going to talk about, the NYAG's response in the as the DCG saga continues to unfold. We're going to talk a little bit about Nocturne. Nocturne was something that famously was backed by Vitalik, creator of Ethereum, and it has been shut down. We'll talk about the machinations behind that. We'll talk a little bit about.
Well, they closed it, so it wasn't shut down by somebody else.
They closed it. They voluntarily closed it, which, honestly, given all the circumstances, is probably the right thing to do. And then we'll talk a little bit about Linea, which is an L2, that temporarily shut down. So something shut down permanently, something shut down temporarily. What the hell is going on? Let's find out. So, John, tell me, give me the latest dish on the NYAG's response to DCG, because I haven't really been caught up on that.
Yeah, so we talked a couple weeks ago about DCG's latest arguments in their ongoing dispute with the New York Attorney General and other authorities. So there was some motions to dismiss filed by DCG, Genesis, and then some current former management, whatever, Barry Silbert and Michael Morrow, and maybe even some other people. So this is the government's response to those motions to dismiss. And it's interesting because you're starting to see the difference between what is legally known as puffery, which is part of their defense, and the way sort of financial regulations work. So a lot of their motion to dismiss claims boiled down to, saying we have the greatest website, we have the greatest product, we have the most secure, whatever, is just standard business. Puffery is the legal term, boisterous, somewhat unjustified. And that's all, kind of legal and okay sometimes. But it's not really okay specifically for financial services things and related to that, and the fraud standards are not quite the same there. For example, they're claiming that statements they made about the balance sheet is strong. Right? Everybody says our financial position is fantastic, and that's just puffery. That you can't. If a company says we're the greatest company in the world, you can't go after them because they're not the greatest company in the world. They're just a company. Right? That's a thing that's generally accepted. However, they say, our balance sheet is strong and we've absorbed the losses. The government's response is, those are specific statements, and you're not allowed to, you can say we're the greatest. You can't say we're the greatest because our balance sheet equity is X and we've absorbed these losses. And if those things aren't true, normally when you're making soft claims about tech products or, our car is the fastest,
if you use terms like awesome, bodacious, splendid, stuff like that, you should be okay. When you use things like balance sheet, P&L, revenue,
liquidity on balance sheet,
NAV, these terms which have very specific meanings on a set of financial statements, you will likely get in trouble.
Yeah. So there's a lot of back and forth on that, where it really does look like, and this is known to be a big trend in the space, tech people with sort of typical tech attitudes, tech boisterism, are saying this is just normal. We're allowed to say our platform is better than yours, and the government's response is no. The fraud standards under the Martin Act are not that. Right? There's a particularly amusing section where they claimed, and I was curious how the government would respond to this. They claimed that some of the retweeting can't possibly form part of this conspiracy or defraud or any of those things because they're protected under the Communications Decency Act. So this is Essentially, their argument is we're just repeating public content that's already out there, so it's not a problem. And the response is, well, not exactly, because you, as the manager of this company, as a control person of this company, are repeating and republishing the company's claims that you knew to be false as part of an ongoing conspiracy to defraud people. Whether or not it is true that that conspiracy and defrauding happened, the government's just saying this needs to go to
get
trial.
litigated. Yeah.
These are fact questions. So that's kind of interesting. The Communications Decency Act is you didn't use that as protection for your retweets. And to be fair, that should protect you if you have nothing to do with the
That's
company and you
correct.
just retweet some garbage from somebody else.
So let's just put this in context. If you tell the lie, somebody picks up your lie and then writes an article about your lie, and then you retweet the article that was based on your lie, guess what? The provenance checks out. You still told the lie. So
Well, here they didn't write the article. It's that the
but
company that they were one of the managers of produced the document.
exactly.
So
it's the same. Like if you lie to a journalist, and then they write an article about it, and then you retweet what the journalist wrote about, then you have still perpetuated the lie.
Well, no, sorry. There's a difference here, which I think is important for understanding how these things work. So they are oftentimes asserting that I'm a person, not the company. You can't hold me liable for what the company did, or this company owns that company.
No, but he's a control person.
No, exactly. That's
the point I'm trying to make.
Generally, for financial stuff, even if it's not you gave an interview, it's your communications director at your company gave an interview.
Yeah.
Your company issued a statement. You're personally liable to the extent there's financial fraud there.
So it's interesting. The whole thing was interesting. This whole journey has actually been interesting for me because I've often wondered how what happens when tech bros enter the financial services sector in a meaningful way, which is kind of what crypto is, because it's that big mishmash combination of financial services and technology. And then the tech bro attitude, unfortunately, doesn't really work and augur itself well with heavily regulated.
Well, I mean, part of the issue here is these were not really heavily regulated. The Genesis relationship with Gemini Earn that sort of forms the basis of this whole set of complaints. The problem there was that they had billions of dollars from hundreds of thousands of retail investors, and you don't normally get to run such a thing without regulation.
Exactly.
So, you're unlikely to make a lot of complicated public statements that include possibly false statements if you're trying to hold off your 15 professional creditors that are calling you directly.
Yeah.
It's more like you're trying to hold off tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of retail investors. And so you end up getting yourself in situations that are very different than just issuing heavily lawyered statements to the three people you owe money to. So there I think they're used to dealing on retail platform type situations, but instead they're making financial products, and that does seem to have gotten mashed up a bit. In the Martin Act, the New York general fraud statute as relates to dealings in securities and commodities and other whatever financial things is perhaps a little bit of an outlier in its generality in the world, but it's been used for a long time and is not new, and it is it's the sort of thing where you can disagree with it, but you cannot argue it isn't clear. Right, there are people who have problems with the Martin Act at a high level, but the Martin Act is from, I think, before the First World War, 1913
it's a long
or
time
something.
Ago,
It's a very, very old thing. I think it's old anyway. It's not recent. It was used. The Elliot Spitzer stuff against the AIG was also partially Martin Act based. Lots of stuff's been Martin Act based. It gives the state of New York broad powers to enforce against fraud in a very general sense when it comes to financial dealing, which is sort of related to New York being such a major financial center for a long time. So the state's a broad latitude. You can't just lawyer your way out of it. Emerged partially from the robber baron era in the end of the 19th century, where people really were coming up with absurd, transparent schemes and saying, well, I have limited liability, so you can't come after me. And that worked in some cases. The old days, people cornering gold markets and making 6% of GDP in 2 years on some SPV, whatever, liabilities renounced type situation. Anyway, it grows out of a long history of people who were very clever trying to take money and not have to pay it back. And that's why it's so broad.
All right. Shifting gears a little bit. Nocturne shut down. So Nocturne, for those of you who are not familiar with it, it's a privacy protocol kind of thing. It was famously backed by Vitalik, who's credited with.
Well, they raised money from a few VCs.
Yeah, they did. But he was the one who more famously backed it, and then they had some high-profile VCs back it as well. What's the story there?
So this thing launched not a year ago, 8 months
like
ago,
December,
9 months ago, something
September,
like that, late
something
last year.
like
It's always been quite small, so we have some data we can bring up in a second. The total volumes through this were never huge. And so they were claiming that they offered private accounts. Conceptually, private accounts works just like a mixer, where you can deposit into a protocol, and then you have ways of trading anonymously with other users of the protocol, and then you can withdraw. If you ask how is that different than Tornado Cash, the answer is conceptually it's not. It's Tornado Cash with the added feature that people can quite easily trade with each other. And so I can deposit $100 into the mixer, you can deposit $100 into the mixer, and then I can trade dollars with you in the mixer. We can deposit different tokens and trade with each other, and it's all sort of hidden within the mixer, and then we use a similar procedure for withdrawing out of the mixer. As with most of the other services that aren't super large, it was custodial and centralized in practice. Their documentation was mixed on this, but it didn't take very long looking at the code to figure out that they rely on upgradable proxy contracts, and they're owned by a Gnosis safe where the signer on the safe is the deployer for the original contract. So, okay, not a lot of obfuscation achieved there. They have their claim is that they've shut this down because they see a need for privacy, but they don't see a way forward with the current tools that are available in the ecosystem, and they've chosen to work on a different problem. I would argue that part of the reason they've shut it down is they seem to have realized, and likely their lawyers told them, that they were going to get in trouble if this ever processed the real amount of money. So we can just very quickly...
I'll go ahead and do that.
Okay.
Yep.
Bring up some data here for Nocturne.
Okay, 1 second, and...
Oh. All right, there we go.
There you go.
So this is one of the contracts. I don't actually remember which contract is which. It doesn't even really matter. So here, there's a couple $1 million coming in and out, and real numbers of transactions, but they're not. It was actually a major user of RETH for whatever reason. Quite a few of the addresses are high RETH users. This is a different one of the addresses. So again, you can see. So this is part of this trading within the pool. So it had facilities where you would deposit one type of token and get stuff back out, trading through Uniswap, use other protocols to trade. So these are effectively private within pool transactions, similar to a couple of other tools that are out there. And you can see none of these amounts are particularly huge. Again, here, this is a different, I don't remember, it doesn't matter which address is which. The wrong screen there. Okay, this is a weird one. Different forwarding thing, whatever, it comes in. And then different address. So, you can see this was used more than zero, but it was not used a huge amount. It was somehow big in RETH, and people did do private Uniswap usage through this thing, but not in huge amounts of money. So it probably started, probably it started in November then. That's fine. So got there. So that's been closed, and I think that raises real questions about how viable the privacy sector is going forward, because these people had money. They had built a simple system. It's got 4 contracts with some implementation contracts upgradable underneath that. But it was sort of comically centralized, and that was still getting money from people and was endorsed by reasonably high-profile people that are supposed to know what they're talking about. So it makes you wonder whether people realize that this is not a solvable problem in this particular way. They talk about how they want to extend the privacy pools concept that was published. Similar group of ETH, whatever, developers. I think that's about 8-9 months ago now. And they acknowledge the problem with privacy pools is that they couldn't keep the whitelist up to date. Right? They couldn't keep the blacklist fast enough, whatever. So this thing has the same problem as all of the other solutions that are based on published lists in advance, which is if your list is out of date, your list will always be out of date. New accounts can be created for free at any time. Then you're just going to end up processing bad people's money, and if it's in your custody, you're screwed.
I have no idea how you... I've never thought this was a solvable problem, but maybe you guys have a better idea out there. basically, I think you wrote a paper on this as well. Basically, because it's trivial to create new addresses and for you to maintain both the blacklist and a whitelist, first of all, you can't run a permissionless system, because if you run a permissionless system, you almost inevitably would.
Well, you can have a permissionless system as long as
You don't take fees.
Well, as long as you're not like operating.
Yeah, if you're not operating.
This is the conflict that people seem to be butting their heads up against. I think there are some partial solutions to this, but they're not things that people are looking at all at the moment. If you've got, so in this case, deposits had to be approved by somebody before they went into the pool, and that approval process is driven off chain. Somebody has to vouch for your money being clean. Like, if you're going to have a step like that, obviously, if the list isn't up to date, you're in trouble. If it's truly permissionless and there's no gatekeeping, okay, right? Tornado Cash still runs. You're arresting the guys or whatever. This doesn't stop the system from running. Their problem seems to be that they still have a centralized system because they want to kick out the bad actors, but then they realize they can't successfully kick out the bad actors. All right.
It's yeah. So on that note, let's move on to Linea's temporary shutdown, because all right, I mean, I'm no expert on blockchains, but from what I understand, aren't they supposed to just keep chugging?
Yes, so Linea is a admittedly centralized, aspirationally decentralized layer 2 Ethereum scaling solution blockchain built by consensus, and there were some hack issues. It doesn't actually matter what the underlying problem is. And so the operator and developer of the system announced that they would be pausing the blockchain. I think the last time I recall someone publicly announcing they were going to pause a blockchain for safety was actually Luna. Mm-hmm. I don't recall any other time when that sort of happened.
In more recent times, I think Polygon did that as well.
Well, there have been changes for updates and whatnot, but this was more like we're under attack, we're freezing it. Oh, there have definitely been lots of people who've exercised sort of administrative or upgrading the contracts. I don't mean that. I mean,
pausing the thing.
We're going to protect the money.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. So their documentation, it's the usual, roll up layer 0, 1, 2, 3, level 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever. And they acknowledge that their system is primarily centralized at the moment, which I guess if you can not only shut the bridges down, but actually stop the blockchain, it's extremely centralized.
Which is fair because they aspire to decentralization.
Yeah.
So.
But what we're going to do here very quickly is we're just going to bring up some data. So these are volumes. Their bridging scheme is a little bit complicated, so the inflows and outflows are on different screens. Just like with Nocturne, we're not going to worry too much about which contract is which. Doesn't matter. This is part of one of the bridging schemes. And you can see that these are real amounts of money, right? These are lots and lots of ETH. So this thing has not processed. Nocturne was small. These people have now shut down a system that processed $1 billion in value from one counterparty in one direction, and then this is a wider variety of tokens. They use different bridges for ERC20 tokens and for native tokens, whatever. So this is definitely a big active thing that they've been running in what is now inarguably a centralized custodial process without any KYC or anything like that. So that could be interesting to watch. And you can see there's huge variety in tokens and addresses and lots of stuff here. What I find most amusing there is that they had some sort of size limits and whatnot for things that could go through the system, but then the bridge documentation says things like, if you want to write your own custom bridge for your token, contact us so we can block your token on the canonical bridge and you can run your own bridge. Like that. Okay. Similarly, they have a layer 2 chain and a layer 1 chain, and there's a communication process between those. So we know from academic results more than 5 years ago now that trustless bridges are not, trustless cross-chain, cross-trust domain bridges are not possible. Fine, that's been known for a long time. That's why you get all these cockamamie schemes to try to ferry stuff from place to place. So what these guys have done is they've set up a trusted messaging layer, which is fine because it has to be trusted, and they've acknowledged it's a trusted messaging layer, and they've said that they're going to come up with a way to make it trustless in the future, or I think they say decentralized, but what they mean is trustless. A lot of this is similar to the way that, for example, Layer 0 works. What you've got here is a system either that's completely trusted, centralized, and in that case you have to trust that one of two people isn't lying to you. Oh, okay, and there are only two people. Right? Their solution that's generally proposed is, well, we'll make it permissionless to participate in this process. All that means is you don't even know who it is you're trusting, but you still have to trust whoever's ferrying the messages back and forth. Or you can go the chain link route, where people vote on whether or not the messages that are relayed accurately. But since there's no gold standard for communicating information from point A to point B, the chain link folks can just ratify the wrong answer, and that's what's there. Right? So anyway, in the case of Linea, there are quite a few spots where they've acknowledged that they have complete control over the system, and it's interesting to watch them exercise it in such a heavy-handed fashion so publicly, having had a fair amount of money go through the bridges, whatever, run on the network. I suspect that's, having been through the architecture, I suspect that's because the setup is so convoluted that there is no single point that you could turn off. It has all kinds of points of centralization. If you talk about something like Polygon, that people joked was just a multi-sig years ago, if it is in fact just a multi-sig, you just freeze that thing and you're good, right? Or you say that that's going offline for maintenance or something. This system had all kinds of different components that were points of centralization, and so I suspect they concluded the only way they could safely stop anything was to turn all of that stuff off. Right. So if you freeze deposits and withdrawals on the bridge side for a centralized bridge attached to an L2, the L2 can still run. It'll catch up eventually. Right. All these networks have an operator address that is just an externally owned account that publishes whatever the data that's necessary to keep the L1 up to date with what's happening on the L2. They could just stop publishing data and then publish it all later. That would be acknowledging control, but it's a bit less heavy-handed than publicly turning the thing off. But there we are. So that's the best solution that Consensus, who are one of, if not the largest developers in the space, have come up with, which frankly does not suggest that there are a tremendous number of wonderful ideas in that part of the space.
And on that note, thanks for tuning in. Thanks for the likes, the comments, and the subscribes. We really appreciate it when you guys do that. And then we'll see you again next week, I guess. Bye-bye.
Yeah.